Well, let's go. Constitutional structure. Third time's the charm, I hope. As I told you in class today, this messed up. But I'm going to make it a little shorter, too, and manage to make that happen for you. So, the preamble. This is the beginning of the Constitution. Basically, the Constitution is divided into three parts. You have the preamble, which states the goals and objectives of our founders. What did they want to accomplish when they created this Constitution? What did they want to accomplish as far as the outcomes of the structure that they created? They wanted to establish order, justice, domestic tranquility, etc. We watched the Star Trek video in class today, but it's also linked for anybody who missed it. It's linked right below this video. And I've also linked a video of the preamble according to Barney Fife. So these are just some kind of fun looks at the preamble. And I didn't put it into this video based on feedback from the first lecture where that didn't work very well. The next part of the Constitution. Now, Article 1, there's 7 articles in the Constitution, and they set up the branches and the structure and of federalism. They set up the amendment process, supremacy. We'll ignore Article 7. Article 7 just says that, once 9 states ratify it, it's in effect. And so that's really not, other than the fact that each succeeding state has to also agree to abide by it. I don't think it has much importance for us in this setting, so we'll look at the first 6. And then the third part are the amendments, which there are 27 of them, and you need to learn them. I'm going to quiz you on them next week, so if you don't already know them, you need to learn them, because that does sometimes show up on the AP exam, and I've had it negatively impact kids when I didn't make you learn it, because the context of the STEM did not tell them what it meant. Okay, but so let's start with the articles. Don't stress over the amendments yet. Article 1 deals with legislative power. Okay, I've got here that it deals with the legislative branch, and it does. It sets up the structure of a bicameral legislature. It sets out the powers. It talks about qualifications for office and how they'll be, chosen and that sort of thing, who they have to represent. But what it really does is it deals with legislative power. And it's important to look at what's called the vesting clause in the Constitution. At the beginning of each of these 3 articles, there is a statement where they vest power into the 3 branches. And the vesting clauses are different. Okay? And in Article 1, the vesting clause says something along the lines of all powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, or in the House and the Senate. That herein vested part, okay, let's see if I can write on this with any success. The herein vested part references this aspect, that the powers that are granted to Congress we only let them have the powers we've expressly and specifically given them. You'll sometimes see that also referred to as the enumerated powers. So in Article 1, Section 8, it lists 17 specific powers to coin money, to declare war, etc., that we've expressly granted to the Congress. And they're not supposed to do anything else. With one caveat, they also gave us this, the necessary and proper clause, also called the elastic clause. And that clause allows them to expand those powers so that they can meet the needs of the nation at various times. And of course, the Anti-Federalists argued against this power, but it stayed in. And without it, we would not have had the growth that we have had in the United States. The other thing I want to talk about is this whole House and Senate thing. Now, the House has always been intended to represent the interests of the people. Okay, that's the people's house. The Senate was intended to represent the states. Remember, as they gave up the Confederation, they're also giving up their sovereignty and authority that they had under the Confederation. And so they wanted a representative in Washington, and the Senate is going to serve that purpose until the passage of the 17th Amendment in 1913. As a result of these two very different constituencies, they also have different kinds of power. Okay? If you look at Article 1, Section 8, and we'll actually look all of Article 1, you'll notice that there are some powers that are very different. For instance, if they're going to spend your money, that bill has to start in the House of Representatives because that is your representative. Okay? If you want to approve a treaty that's been negotiated, okay, that's going to be approved by the Senate because it's sort of that idea that this is a federation and the constituent parts of the federation would approve an agreement with a foreign nation. So that's a power that's been granted to the Senate only. So if you ever have a question about who has what power, and I don't want you to memorize what specific powers each house has, but think about why they have the powers they do. And that should lead you, in a situation where you don't know the answer, it should lead you to the right answer. Because you can say, well, that's probably the power of the House because of the constituency, or because of the way it's operate. Okay, so think about why when you're ever in doubt. Now in Article 2, they set up the executive. And the vesting clause there is not herein granted. It says executive power shall be vested in a president. That's very different because it leads to, it's more vague and broad. It's not as specific. Now there are some specific things. Okay, so for instance, it lists commander-in-chief and chief diplomat. It talks about appointment of officials and veto of congressional acts. Those are very specific powers. But he was to be independent of them. And as Hamilton wrote, they wanted a president who was energetic. Okay, what does energetic mean? Does it mean he's going to, go jogging around the White House? I don't think so. I would define energetic as flexible. That they wanted the president to have the flexibility to do what was necessary to meet the needs of a nation at various times. And so that's why his vesting clause is much broader and vaguer. Article 2 is also much shorter. Article 1 takes up almost half of the Constitution. They feared the legislative branch as potentially the most dangerous, and so they wanted to control it in this system of limited government the most. So it's going to be the longest. Now, let's move on to the judicial. The judicial branch is very loosely set up in Article 3. It says that, and their vesting clause is also pretty vague, just basically judicial power is vested in the Supreme Court and any inferior courts, not with the definition of bad, but lower was what inferior would mean, that are created by Congress. Okay, so it gives the power to create those inferior courts to Congress, which it has done, but it only actually sets up the Supreme Court. It's very short. It talks about term of office, which is good behavior. We tend to shorthand that to lifetime, but it actually says on good behavior. You can impeach and remove judges, and some have been impeached and removed. It sets up the process to select them. They are appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate. All confirmations are by the Senate, so it was the states agreeing. Okay? And they talk about judicial supremacy a little bit, but it's really this independence that gives that judicial supremacy, so they're not beholden politically to the others. Now, what do they do? That's not talked about in the Constitution at all. It's sort of implied from the common law understanding of what courts do, and it talks about them having appellate jurisdiction, which if they're going to hear an appeal, that implies judicial review. But there's nothing specifically stated in there. Where we get their power of judicial review is from Federalist 78, which is written by Hamilton. Now here's a nice little graphic. You might want to pause and look at it. I'm not going to spend much time on it in the course of events, but I like this graphic from the old textbook, which just sort of shows what each branch does in a shorthand method. But you know, the predominant power for the legislature is to write law, the executive to enforce it, and the judicial to interpret it. Okay, this process can be very quick or very slow. If there is widespread agreement as to what the law should be, then it gets passed quickly, it gets signed quickly, and the judicial branch might never get involved. If there's not widespread agreement, say with the health care law, then, you know, in that case, 38 states and several special interest groups immediately challenged its constitutionality, and it had to go through the court process of interpretation. Now, putting aside 5 for a second, we're going to look at 4 and 6 together. Article 4 and 6 deal with national unity and power. Article 4 is the federalism article. It sets up the relationship between the states and the national government, what are their responsibilities and duties, etc., to one another. It also sets up the relationship of the states to one another, because they do have certain duties and responsibilities to each other as well. And then 6 deals with supremacy, which was very important. You know, they wanted stability, which they didn't have under the Articles of Confederation, and so they had to have supremacy for federalism to work. Now, let's talk about Article 5. If we could shorthand Article 5, one word, change. Article 5 deals with the process of making changes to this Constitution. There is a formal amendment process. It is 2 steps. It requires the participation of both the national government and the state government, so it embodies the principle of federalism. Don't forget that. 2 methods for proposal, 2 methods for ratification. You know, don't get hung up on memorizing the percentage votes or anything. Just remember that it requires less, you know, it's a smaller percentage for proposal and a larger percentage for ratification. So there's 2 methods for proposal. It can be passed by resolution in the House and the Senate with a 2/3 vote and then sent out to the states. And so far, every constitutional amendment has used this method. Or if 2/3 of the states, and right now that would mean 34, asked for a constitutional convention, then Congress is supposed to call a constitutional convention. That method has not been used, I think partially because it would be very expensive. You'd have to have elections in every state. You'd have to pay all the expenses of the delegates to go there. And then there's a little bit of a danger factor. You know, what if they decided to do like they did in 1787 and just completely throw away the Constitution and start over? So we've never used this second method, okay? Once it's proposed, Congress sends it to the states. And they'll send it with instructions. Congress will set the method of ratification. There's 2 methods here. They'll also set a time limit. Now, they didn't used to do that, and that's how we ended up with the 27th Amendment taking over 200 years to be ratified. But since the 20th Amendment, they have generally set a time deadline of 7 years. Okay? They will send it out with instructions to the state legislatures. Most of the time, they will send it to the legislature and say, hey, look at this. Get back with us within the 7-year deadline, please. And it requires 3/4 of the states, which is 38. The other option is to send it to the state legislatures and call for them to have elections and hold a state ratifying convention. Each state would set this up themselves. They could change the, is it just a simple majority vote? How is it done? Now, this method does uphold the idea of popular sovereignty, because with method 1, it's your normal state representatives voting, not people you chose based on that issue, but just your representatives in general. With method 2, however, you would choose delegates based on what their opinion was on that issue. They would meet, they would vote, and then they would disband. Okay? Now here's a chart and a graphic of it, which kind of shows you this little flow chart thing of what we've just been talking about. Keep in mind we have never used this method at all. The normal route is this one. And one time we have used that one. And that was for the passage of the 21st Amendment, which repealed prohibition, which was very contentious. It was a 50-50 split in the country. And, you know, poor legislators, if they'd left it to the legislatures, they were really in a darned if you do, darned if you don't situation. You know, no matter which way they turned, it would have potentially been a wrong decision. So instead, they called those conventions, upheld popular sovereignty, told people, well, hey, you chose the people to vote for this. It brings up an interesting point of, you know, if we had a controversial amendment come out today, as I think it was Sean mentioned in class today, it was either Sean or Hunter, that, you know, we're kind of due for it because they tend to come in spurts. You know, there's lots of ideas percolating in my head of things that are so contentious in society today that we might want to consider it. But, you know, say they sent out an abortion amendment or a gay marriage amendment. My money is on them using this method of ratification. I don't know that, but I would imagine that's the method they would go with. Now, that was the formal amendment process. Most of the change to the Constitution, though, has not been done formally. It's been done informally. It's changes that come about due to the customs, practice, and interpretation of the Constitution by both our government officials and by other groups. Okay? My first draft of this really belabored this issue of examples of how each branch does it. And then I looked in your textbook this morning and noticed that they had given you quite a few examples. Let me just add a couple examples I know they didn't. So, for instance, the legislative branch, they talk about, you know, setting up aspects like the Judiciary Act. It also happens when they fulfill their non-legislative powers, though. So, for instance, with impeachment, you can impeach an official, and impeachment's the charge. It's not a conviction, it's just the official charge. You can impeach for treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. Well, you know, other high crimes and misdemeanors. What is a misdemeanor? Okay. In 21st century language, a misdemeanor is a minor crime for which you will serve up to a year in jail and, you know, maybe pay a fine. That is not what it meant to them. Okay? For them, it was a mistake in your demeanor. In other words, it meant to do something that was dishonorable. Now, this is awful. Honor was important to them. I mean, they fought duels over it. They killed people over it. So, you know, defending your honor was a really important thing. And so basically what they said was treason, bribery, and, gosh, we can't come up with everything wrong that somebody would do that we'd want to get rid of them for. So, you know, if they do something dishonorable, they can be impeached and potentially removed. So every time that the Congress impeaches someone, and they've impeached a bunch of judges, only 2 presidents, they've removed judges, they've not removed presidents. It's like they took that phrase, other high crimes and misdemeanors, and they added on to it, including, but not limited to, and they've added a list of things. You know, this is that change by custom or precedent. Your book talks about executive agreements, which is an excellent example of how the executive has changed meaning. And, of course, for the judiciary, every time they practice judicial review, they are further clarifying our understanding of what the Constitution means, which is a sort of an informal change, potentially. Modern developments can change the meaning. Presidential power has shifted some with the advent of things like electronic communication, the development of atomic weapons, you know, the internet, etc. Sometimes we, the public, make demands on the president and on Congress for policies that will test limits, you know, in times of crisis. 9/11, in response to concerns of the public about how this could have happened, you know, using public library, free internet connections with taxpayer dollars, yada, yada, yada. And they passed the Patriot Act. That was a demand of the public. And that really greatly expanded the power of the government for surveillance. And some parts of it have been struck down, other parts have not. Now, the Constitution and democracy. Democratic government was despised and feared amongst 18th century upper class society. So instead they created a republic, which was a representative form of democracy modeled after the sort of Lockean tradition of of government. But one of the central themes of American history is the gradual democratization of the Constitution. There have been several formal amendments which have increased access and participation by the citizenry in this country and have expanded upon liberty and equality. Okay, some amendments have been proposed that would go even farther with that and not ratified. One of the most famous examples of that would be the Equal Rights Amendment. While much of the Constitution reinforces individualism, it also provides multiple access points for citizens. Federalism gives you state and local government as well as national government. You can get involved at various points in the process. And of course, separation of powers and checks and balances allows almost all groups some place in the political system. Some people say, though, that there's so much checking built into our system that effective government becomes very difficult, if not impossible, because it encourages stalemate or gridlock, and it limits the government's ability to really do what we need it to do at certain times. Another important distinction is that our system and our nation is not strictly based on democratic principles. Writing this Constitution was a response to the disorder and chaos that was starting to happen with things like Shays' Rebellion and under the Articles of Confederation. So they wanted to strengthen congressional economic powers, and that trumped issues of things like equality. Okay? We do have protection of individual rights guaranteed, and that takes us back to that whole democracy argument. Sometimes a majority will overrule that minority in ways that are not very egalitarian or don't promote equality. And so, that's something that we've worked out as we've gone, and we'll talk about this more later when we talk more about like strict construction and loose construction, which you guys alluded to in discussion today. It's an interesting debate, and we will have it. Another point that y'all have made is sort of that, and I think your Lanahan 11 brought this issue up, of the comparison between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, the spirit and the letter. If you had to come up with one word to summarize the Declaration of Independence and one word to summarize the Constitution, what would you choose? Okay, many leading scholars would choose for the Declaration of Independence, that justified revolution. And the reason it justified revolution is that they felt that their liberty was being violated by Parliament and the King. So the one-word summation for the Declaration of Independence would be liberty. For the Constitution, again, they're trying to create order where they don't feel enough exists. We've fought a revolution. We've won it. It's time to get on with real life and the building of a nation and prosperity. And to have that prosperity and successfully build the nation, you need stability. So the word for the Constitution would be stability. There are other contrasts that can be made between the two documents. On the issue of equality, the Declaration refers to the equality of man, and the Constitution really doesn't deal with that until the 14th Amendment in 1868. The Declaration on Natural Rights talks about God-given inalienable rights. The Constitution doesn't do that. And of course, we get the Bill of Rights, but that's another process. And again, democracy itself, basically conventional wisdom says that the Declaration of Independence endorses democracy, but the Constitution itself is not really that democratic. Elections aren't even set up in the Constitution. That's left to the states. And then a final contrast deals with the right to revolution. The Declaration specifically recognizes that right, and while the Constitution gives Congress authority to punish those that they find guilty of treason. Hooray, last slide. I think I've managed to make this much shorter lecture too. That was a really fast overview of the structure of the Constitution and the ways in which it can be changed. If you have questions, please bring them to class tomorrow. And I leave you with these questions. Pause it before you let the video end and maybe jot down some of your answers or thoughts about it. We'll do an activity tomorrow dealing with this issue of change. So think about what kinds of change you think needs to be done as we have our little competition